that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, the whole House is deeply indebted to the noble Lord Risby for initiating today's debate, but also for the way in which he has introduced it, and indeed for the work that he has done for the people of Ukraine now over so many years. In reinforcing his speech, I'll divide my own remarks into two parts. Firstly, why the Holodomor matters in understanding events in Ukraine today, and secondly, why and how the determination of what is a genocide is still an issue that has to be resolved. I first heard about the Holodomor when I visited Ukraine in 1989 with a small Jubilee campaign delegation. I've never forgotten the sheer courage and the determination of pro-democracy activists whom I met on the streets of Lviv as they risked their own lives to throw off the shackles and the chains of the Soviet Union. We met people whose family in the preceding generation had lost their lives in the Holodomor, Stalin's mass starvation of the Ukraine, that man-made famine that convulsed Ukraine from 1932 until 1930 and 1933. As Stalin replaced Ukraine's small farms with state-run collectives and punished independent-minded Ukrainians, the Holodomor, a combination of the Ukrainian words for starvation and to inflict death, led to millions of people dying. The writer Alex de Waal described the Holodomor as, and I quote, a hybrid of a famine caused by calamitous social economic policies and one aimed at a particular population for repression or punishment. In Ukraine, I've visited Greek Catholic churches that Stalin had closed 40 years earlier, and where every day fresh flowers were defiantly left at the doors to replace the ones removed earlier by Soviet soldiers. Religious belief was violently repressed. I met courageous people like Bishop Pavlo Vasilik and Ivan Gel, a politician and a dissident, a member of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, and the Ukrainian Christian Democratic Party, and between them they'd spent 17 and 18 years in the Soviet death camp at Perm. I met a young priest who had been sent 3 years earlier as a punishment to Chernobyl without any protective clothing in order to clear radioactive waste. My Lords, those people wanted their story known, and I was grateful to the BBC and to the independent newspaper in enabling us to do so. Stories matter, not least the story of the Holodomor, because we forget too easily the price that has been paid for our liberties. The stories matter because they illustrate why, even as we are meeting here at Westminster, Ukrainians are fighting to the bitter end to protect their hard-won freedoms, and why they will resist Putin's attempts to resurrect a Russian empire, which ultimately means the death of their nation. They'll resist his attempts to crush democratic rights and sovereignty, to roll the clock back, reversing the gains made across Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Putin's deluded idea that these brave people would line the streets with flowers, cheering the new imperial occupation and the reconquest of their country, simply beggars belief. Since Putin instigated his illegal war, under the obscene pretext of protecting people from genocide, I've often thought about the people I met then and since, and about the courage and bravery of Ukraine's anti-Soviet faith-led pro-democracy movement. I've often thought about the price of political progress, the illegal demonstrations I attended where Ukrainians in their thousands proudly held aloft their blue and yellow flags of defiance, and how religious freedom had been so violently repressed. And as I've watched the consequences of Putin's orders to destroy vast acres of arable land, to destroy crops, to prevent grain reaching the hungry people in the developing world, especially Africa, to abduct and remove Ukrainian children, I thought back to the conversations I had 35 years ago about Stalin's Holodomor. Stalin's Holodomor, like Putin's today, was an entirely man-made catastrophe, leading from anything from 3.5 million deaths to 5 million deaths, or possibly the figure that the noble Lord Risby gave the House, as many as 10 million. In determining genocide, though, numbers are not the issue. Motive is the issue, and I'll come back to that later. Many historians do regard this as technically, formally, properly a genocide. The Holodomor was methodically planned, and it was executed by denying the producers of the food the sustenance necessary for survival. It does seem especially cruel and perverse to have used food as a genocidal weapon in the breadbasket of Europe. As Ukrainians resorted to eating grass and acorns and even cats and dogs, as we've heard, Stalin banned any reference to famine. His decree of 5 stalks of grain stated that anyone, even a child, caught taking produce from a collective field could be shot or imprisoned for stealing socialist property. In 1933, 2,000 people were executed. While people were starving to death in the terror famine, the Soviet state stole over 4 million tons of Ukraine's grain, enough to meet the needs of 12 million people in a year. My Lords, in 1997 I founded the Roscoe Lectures, a public lecture series hosted by Liverpool John Moores University. And in 2009 I invited the writer Anne Applebaum to give one of the Roscoe Lectures. It was entitled Hitler and Stalin, the 20th Century's Cruelest Tyrants. Subsequently, in 2018, she published her magnificent Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. In it, she says the famine was launched by the Soviet leadership, a disaster specifically targeted at Ukraine and Ukrainians. In harrowing testimonies, we hear from Tetiana Pavlichka, who remembered that her sister, Tamara, quotes, had a large swollen stomach and her neck was long and thin like a bird's neck. People didn't look like people. They were more like starving ghosts. Applebaum quotes another survivor who remembered that his mother, quotes, looked like a glass jar filled with clear spring water. All her body that could be seen was seen through and filled with water like a plastic bag. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Applebaum was able to access previously unseen archival material, which she says, I quote, backs up the testimony of the survivors. Starvation was the result of the forcible removal of food from people's homes, the roadblocks that prevented peasants from seeking work or food, the harsh rules of the blacklists imposed on farms and villages, the restrictions on barter and trade, and the vicious propaganda campaign designed to persuade Ukrainians to watch unmoved as their neighbours died of hunger. She cites extraordinary statistics which graphically illustrate the scale of the deaths and the lives cut short. The noble Lord Risby referred to this. She says females born in Ukraine in 1933 lived an average to be 8 years of age. Males born in 1933 could expect to live to the age of 5. Such terrible experiences were within the living memory of some of those I met in 1989. Others have been told the stories by parents and grandparents and had vowed never to forget and use every sinew to struggle for a free Ukraine. Lest anyone imagine that such shocking experiences can easily be expunged or erased, I can say as the son of a native Irish speaker that my mother told me the stories of the Irish famine, which had occurred 100 years earlier. The deaths and emigration of millions poisoned British-Irish relations for decades afterwards. And what memories are being made in Ukraine today? In addition to the daily bombing of civilians and the appropriation of Ukrainian territory and mass displacements, Putin is a mirror image of Stalin, and he's committing food terrorism by purposefully destroying Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure and stealing Ukrainian grain, agricultural machinery. I initiated a debate about this, of course, in your Lordship's House on July the 21st of this year. And since then, we've seen vivid footage of his militias setting fire to fields, scorching the earth and reducing crops to ash. There have been reports from eastern Ukraine of people drinking water from radiators and puddles, and even killing and cooking, as we've heard, stray dogs to avoid starvation. So it's clear why memories of the past are so relevant in this present time. Yet most people in Britain have never heard of the Holodomor, and that shouldn't be the case. The fact that the crime was committed by a communist regime doesn't make it any less bad than a crime committed by a Nazi regime. I would commend the work of James Bartholomew and the Foundation for the History of Totalitarianism. They've been working to make the Holodomor better known. It's created a school assembly plan and 2 lesson plans, all of which are free to download from its website. It's actively promoted these resources to schools. It also recently produced a booklet on the subject and metal lapel badges. And it's held a competition to design a candle holder with the word Holodomor clearly displayed, so that on the appropriate day people can place a candle in their front window and passers-by will know the reason why. The Holodomor should find more of a place in the national curriculum or in the exams set by the various exam boards, and I hope the Minister might comment on that proposal when he replies. But, my Lords, there's a second matter alluded to by the noble Lord, Lord Risby, which I also want to raise. Last year, with Dr. Ewelina Ohab, we published state responses to crimes of genocide. I gave a copy to the noble Lord the Minister. It challenges the long-standing policy of the FCDO on the determination of what is and what is not a genocide. It builds on the amendments passed by this House, all-party amendments, with 3-figure majorities, and private members' bills, the latest of which, the 5th, has just been selected again in this year's ballot for new bills. And I'm particularly pleased to see my noble and learned friend, Lord Hope of Craighead, in the chamber today, because his expertise and knowledge was enormously helpful in the framing of the amendments to the trade bill. My Lords, 2 recent Prime Ministers agreed with us that the determination should be made by the High Court of England and Wales, not by politicians. The FCDO prevented that change, whilst trotting out the repeated line that only a court could decide, knowing that no court is in a position to do so. The former minister told me, my Lords, a member of this House, that it's a deliberate sleight of hand. In the case of the Holodomor, the Canadian Government, Australian Parliament, the United States Congress, and others listed in the excellent House of Lords note for today's debate, have labelled the Holodomor as a genocide by Stalin's Soviet regime. In November 22, the German Federal Parliament passed a resolution put forward by the parties of the coalition government declaring the Holodomor a genocide, as did the European Parliament in December 2022. In May, as we heard from the noble Lord Risby, during a House of Commons debate, Leo Doherty MP, a minister at the FCDO, said the UK government's policy would ensure genocide determinations remain, I quote, above politics, above lobbying, and above individual political or national interests. But in reality, the refusal to allow the English courts to make this decision means that genocide determination remains entirely political and subject to all the things Mr. Doherty says he opposes. It's a sort of illusionist conjuring trick worthy of Houdini. The new Foreign Secretary has a chance to put this right. Of course, the Chinese, who refuse to even allow a debate at the UN about reports concerning Uyghurs, might not like it. My Lords, the Holodomor, like the Armenian genocide, also unrecognised by the FCDO, was about the targeting of a specific group of people. Ukrainians were subjected to mass starvation, exile and displacement, sent to gulags and suffered grievously. And this Soviet genocide was of a piece with other communist genocide in Mao's China and Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia. As we watch the crime of starvation waged against the Ukrainians right now, we need to recollect that this is not the first time this crime has been committed against Ukrainians. And I would draw the attention of the noble Lord the Minister to an investigation by the Starvation Mobile Justice team of experts supporting the work of Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General, and which has revealed evidence of starvation tactics used by Russian soldiers. They say that the techniques were, quotes, designed to break the Ukrainian people. And their findings, published in June 2023, indicated that they collected credible evidence of numerous incidents recorded in Chernihiv that helped to establish a track record, I quote, of repeated and or coordinated attacks resulting in objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population being targeted. Global rights compliance have called for the prosecution of the crime of starvation, and they say that it's crucial to explore the crime of starvation against the definition of genocide in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. My Lords, is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office involved in helping to do that or not? Global rights compliance say, I quote, mass starvation has long been described as a societal torture, and that when directed against, in the case of Ukraine, a national group, the concerted attack of the very foundation and fabric of such groups can be indicative of genocidal intent. To end, my Lords, recognising past and present genocides for what they are is a step to ensuring justice and accountability, a step towards deterring and preventing future genocides, a word which itself means the breaking of the human family, the crime above all crimes. And that is why Lord Risby's initiative today is so important and so welcome.
My Lords,